this horrible, ugly thing called sequestration that's going to reduce the budget to the military over the course of several years. And so the Army now has less money to operate on. The Army has to make some very difficult choices about the size of its force structure that, in our opinion, is not driven by military mission, but driven by budget. It's a very bad place to be, in our opinion. So last year we went down from 570 to 490. This year the Army is going to, throughout the next 12 months, make some decisions about an end strength from 490 to potentially as low as 420,000. And the Army is going to use the same process. So what came out last Thursday evening was the supplemental programmatic environmental assessment. That was an updated copy of what came out last year that looks at not only the environmental impacts of a drawdown in force, which typically there are none. As an Army gets smaller, you don't necessarily have negative impacts to air and soil and noise, those sorts of things. But they also look at the socioeconomic impacts. And of course, that's one of the things that is of dire consequence and is extremely significant, more so in this community than many other military communities across the country. They'll follow that, this 60-day public comment period that we're in now, this fall with listing sessions. And then the Army will update their military value analysis that looks at other military value aspects of Fort Polk. And then Fort Polk, will be scrutinized again. The public action is huge and made a difference last year. It will make a difference again this year. So I wanted to just point out for you real quick what it is that we're fighting for and what we're looking at. The Army has not said anything about the JRTC going away. The Army has made a commitment to the JRTC. We believe in the future of the JRTC and that training mission at Fort Polk. However, the economy here does not survive on the JRTC training mission alone. We have to have these other elements of Fort Polk to support the economy, provide the quality of life, the kind of support that the Army is asking for at Fort Polk. And so, the JRTC is a solid component of Fort Polk. The 162nd Infantry Brigade, we know will get smaller over time. Last year in Army 2020, the 4th Brigade, 10th Mountain Division actually received an additional growth battalion of around 1,300. We haven't received that yet, but the Army has indicated that we will receive that growth in the first part of 2015. The 1st Maneuver Enhancement Brigade drew down, and so last year in Army 2020, we grew the 4th Brigade by 1,300, and we drew down the size of the 1st Maneuver Enhancement Brigade, resulted in a net loss of about 250 soldiers. And of course, we have the 115 Combat Support Hospital and Garrison Dental and Medical Activities. One of the things I'll point to in another slide, my comment, is that we have to look at the other impacts, down the line impacts of a potential loss of this huge component of Fort Polk. And that potential loss is a medical activity that's no longer needed, a hospital that becomes a clinic. There are other down the line impacts, commissary that may not be needed, a PX that may not be needed, other civilian departments in the Army out there that get downsized, along with the fact that we don't have those large numbers of soldiers. So we have to fight for this. We have to make sure that the Army hears from us on this. One of the reasons we've asked you to be here today. And so some of the special considerations. Last year, the Army studied these impacts at 21 bases when they made their first round of cuts. My analysis of that is all the easy cuts are now gone. The Army achieved some of the cuts last year by taking troops away in Europe and downsizing the footprint in other countries. And they made some of those cuts in installations where they may have taken a brigade away, but then they grew the 2 remaining brigades. And so the net impact of those bases was very, very minimal. And all of those easy decisions, if you would, are now off the table. So now they're looking at 30 installations across the country. The increased scope is based on the severity of the potential cuts. If the Army has to draw down to 420, and as we said, they're downsizing from 570,000 to 420,000, which is nearly unprecedented in the realm of scope, size, and length of time they have to do this in that we've ever experienced. So Fort Polk Progress, as an organization, as we did last year, we will put together a very comprehensive response. We will address every line of this supplemental programmatic environmental assessment. We'll challenge every fact and every figure that the Department of the Army used in that, and we will provide a very comprehensive reply back to the Army in this process. We kept our congressional delegation up to speed on this. We're communicating with them frequently. We'll be in their offices on the 29th of July to provide them with what our formal response will be and to ask them for their support, tell them how they can be most helpful. The governor is behind this effort through his director of federal program, Paul Sawyer. Our local government leaders, as you can see today, are up to speed, as our board. The Fort Polk Progress has been informed and shares that information with the other elected bodies in the parish. And I also want to say, although Senator Smith and Representative Arms couldn't be here today, they, together with Speaker Fleckley, other members of the Louisiana legislature in this last session, did appropriate funds to support Fort Polk Progress in this process. They saw what we were able to do as a community last year and as an organization, and I want to thank them for going to bat for us in this last legislative session to provide us the funding we needed to put the most professional, most effective response we can put back to the government. And so we have to remember that although we succeeded in 2013, that is the first phase of what could be several phases of Army downsizing if we can't fix the budget situation through action in Congress. In June of 2013, the Army did inactivate 10 Army Brigade combat teams. In communities such as ours, there are at least 5 brigade combat teams inactivated this year. There'll be 5 more inactivated next year. That was part of last year's decision. And again, what we're talking about here is the 4th Brigade of the 10th Mountain Division being stationed at Fort Polk. Last year, you may remember, out of 8,000 public comments the Army received from 21 bases, over 4,300 of those comments came from Fort Polk. It was maybe one of the first times that I think we truly changed the perception of Fort Polk in the eyes of the Army. That Fort Polk wasn't just a base to train at in a rural area in central Louisiana, but it was a base that was surrounded by communities that cared about soldiers, that cared about that mission, and wanted to invest in the future of that base, a place that you don't just train soldiers, but you bring them and their families here to live. And so that made a big impression on the Army. We have to do that again this year. And then we had the organized and superb turnout during the listening session, 3.5 hours. The very patient folks from the NICON listened to our comments. You know, folks, we can hire economists and we can hire DC consultants to put together the most flashy set of PowerPoint slides you've ever seen, full of all sorts of very complicated numbers and research that we can do. Nothing matters with any of that if the public doesn't respond, because those are just numbers on a page, and every community in this country that's impacted by this will submit numbers on a page back to the government to make this argument. We will reinforce ours, however, by the public's interest, because that's what matters. You know, we can tell them how hurtful it's going to be. If they don't hear from you, I don't think it'll matter. So we'll plead with you to please do that. So the timeline to action for this process, we're now today in a public comment period that lasts through August the 25th. Although these are public comments related to the environmental assessment, it is the only step in this process where by law the Army has to count your comments, they have to summarize those comments, and they have to share those comments with the top levels of leadership within the Army. So we ask you to please do that. We need you to sign and send in your public comments. We're providing written letters with suggested language. Use that. Make up your own stories. Tell your own stories about what the impact could be to you or your history with Fort Polk. We ask you to go to our website, which is more robust now than it was last year, thanks to Tammy Sharp and her team. We will constantly update that information so that you know what to do. This is the address that you write to, an email address, or a phone number. So it's very easy to make your comments known and your thoughts known. In addition to that, we have envelopes already addressed over here for you. We have pens, we have paper, we have letters. We have an iPad that you can sign digitally, and we'll send it in. If you want to do 2 or 3 of those, we will make it easy. I'll come to your house if that makes it easier to get your public comment and send it in. But we need those public comments. So then after the public comment period is closed, the Army will conduct the public listening sessions at all 30 bases once again. As soon as we know the date for that, we'll begin educating the public on how you can be a part of that and let your voice be heard, and most importantly, let your numbers be seen, because that was very impactful last year. It was probably one of those touching moments of this entire process as I left Fort Polk in one of those vans with my back facing the front. And so as we left the gate, not knowing We went out there that morning, what the public turnout and response would be like for this listening session. And the two guys from the Pentagon sitting in the back seat, and all of a sudden they're scrambling for phones and cameras and filming, and we had just left the base. But as I turned around, you could see nothing but people, fire trucks, police cars, people in the backs of their pickup trucks lining that road all the way to Leesville with signs and showing support for the Army. And that made a huge, huge impact on these folks because it made it real. And it made them understand how it touched people's lives and their businesses and their jobs. And it was critical, in my opinion. And so we want to make sure that they see that same thing this year. So we expect the final decision by spring, summer of 2015, most likely around June of 2015. There's really only one alternative. They say there's a no action alternative. That the Army has to make a drawdown. They don't have the money to support 490,000 soldiers. The maximum potential cut at Fort Polk being studied is 6,500 Army personnel. Those have cascading impacts, as we mentioned, that could potentially impact the hospital and other services that we enjoy out at Fort Polk and our veterans and retirees enjoy. And again, and one of the things I harp on the most is it continues to contribute to that boom and bust cycle that we've been the victim of in this area for far too long. And it's my opinion that is one of our strongest arguments to make. You know, our folks here sacrificed in the 1940s when they were moved off their property and gave land up in support of the freedom of our country, and they did so willingly. And through those years, we've supported the Army through all of its boom and bust cycles, done everything we can. Even in recent days and in recent months, they again are acquiring property that are impacting individuals. We're being asked to sacrifice further here. We're building schools for the Army. We'll turn dirt within the next couple of weeks on a new elementary school. About to finish a new high school. All of these things that we think the Army needs to take into consideration. We've made that commitment to the Army. The Army needs to make a minimal commitment back to us. And we believe that the size of the soldiers that we have in Fort Polk now, the troop strength that we have in Fort Polk now, is something that supports the economy in this area. It can help us provide the services that the Army is asking us to provide. Anything lower than that puts into question whether or not we can continue to provide the kind of support that the Army looks for here. The Army says we're not going away and closing. Well, if you're not going away and closing, then you need to make a minimum baseline commitment to what's going to be in Fort Polk. The total loss contemplated between soldiers, Army civilians, and families is 16,000. In the coming weeks, we'll share additional data with you about that's just the Army side of things. That doesn't count the other job losses and the people that leave with them when they lose their job. So we have a lot at stake, and we have a lot to fight for. And so I'll just leave this up here at the end to remind you again that we have multiple ways to respond. What you do as a community and your response is the most important thing you can possibly do. It absolutely will make an impact, absolutely can make the difference in the decision that the Army will make. We'll continue to fight for you as an organization. We're on it every single day through our staff in Washington, through our staff here, through our support throughout the state, with our board of directors, the Fort Polk Progress as well. Not a day that goes by that we're not on this issue, updating data and sending responses. We'll be taking a lot of meetings in Washington with military leadership as well, and working with our congressional delegation to let them know what they can do to be helpful. So with that, I certainly welcome any questions, additional comments, things up. John, you'll know about what I missed, I'm sure.
You did